What's good, guys? Today's video, we're going to compare the DJI smart controller to the Autel Robotics smart controller. The goal in this video is not basically who's better, but it's which is going to suit your needs. And if this is your deciding factor as to what drone you're going to purchase, hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a good understanding of which one of these smart controllers and which ecosystem is right for you. Let's go ahead and get started. What's good, everybody? Ken here. You're watching OriginaldoBo. Today we're going to break it down sort of in different segments on these two devices. We're going to talk about the build quality, the battery life, the silicon in each of these. That's going to encompass performance as well, and also compatibility. So we're talking about 4 different segments when we talk about both of these smart controllers. With that being said, let's go ahead and talk about the build quality of these. All right, so the build quality of both of these smart controllers is really excellent. I don't think anybody's going to complain about either one of these. However, there's some small differences between the two that you may like or dislike. For starters, the DJI smart controller is very svelte. It's small, it's super compact. It's really designed for somebody who wants something. Just they can throw it in their bag. It's just really portable. As to where the Autel smart controller is a big hunk of material. It's huge. It's not going to be quite as portable, and you're definitely not going to be able to travel lightly with it. This is something that you sort of have to plan for your shoots with. It's just a larger device. Now, the things that I like about the DJI smart controller, I love how ergonomic it is in the hands. I love how they already have these built-in grips. This is also where the battery sits in this device. It feels very solid in the hand, and I also like that when the sticks come off of this device, they can stow underneath the antenna. I think that's a genius move, and it also means that your sticks aren't going to get broken or lost in the future. Something that I don't like about this controller is the fact that I cannot remove the antennas. While the antennas are very fast and precise, you can't upgrade them just by unscrewing them and putting a larger antenna on if you need to do that. You're sort of stuck with what you have. On the Autel smart controller side, the sticks are also removable, which is great. However, at first, when I first got this, I thought that there was nowhere to put these sticks, but in closer inspection, there is actually a spot on the controller. If you look just beneath this little metal bar that runs left to right, there's a little area here where you can screw the sticks on the smart controller and keep them for stowing. Now, the problem with this is that they're going to get caught up on things quite easily, and you're going to run the risk of potentially breaking these sticks later on when you do need to use this. Now, Autel does include 2 sets of sticks in the box, but it's just a pain in the ass anytime you do break something like that. Now, the antennas on this device are removable, which I do like that they're removable, but I don't like how I have to constantly fiddle with these stock antennas. You can see as I pull them out, it's just so stiff, they keep unscrewing. And then I have to constantly fight to position them, which I usually like to keep them like this, but I think over a course of time that's going to wear, and this may not be as taut as it is today. So it's just something worth noting, although it is super easy to take these off and replace them with something of your choosing if you want to go that route. So that's actually pretty cool. All right, let's talk about performance of both of these devices. Now, I booted up both of these devices at the same time, and keep in mind the DJI device is a bit older and it's already booted up. And just behind it is the Autel device as well. So the DJI device did get the head start in the boot up process by about 2 seconds. Autel is sort of just right behind it. I mean, if we want to be technical, I think that the DJI device is a little faster at booting up. That just could be because of the startup processes. But what I want to talk about is the silicon that is located under the hood of both of these, because in 2 years' time, you would expect a dramatic improvement. And unfortunately, we really didn't get the improvement that I was hoping for when Autel announced that they were going to produce a smart controller. So let's go ahead and open up CPU-Z. That's going to let us take a look at the hardware underneath this. And we're going to basically just look at the silicon chipsets. I want to see what processors both of these are running. We have a Rock chipset on this one, which is basically a MediaTek chipset. This is a 6-core on the DJI controller, and it's good for about 1.4 gigahertz of clock speed. And then on the Autel smart controller, we have an octa-core, good for 8 cores, and this boosts up to 1.7 gigahertz, so a little bit faster clock speeds and 2 additional cores to handle some of those tasks. It's also a processor made by Samsung, and the Exynos processors are some of the fastest processors on the market. And given the fact that it's only handling one task, I'm going to give the edge to the Autel smart controller. Moving over to the system side of life, both of these devices do run Android 7.0. However, the smart controller actually from DJI runs a newer version of 7.1.3, and there's some security enhancements in that version. Now, the version of Android looks slightly different between the two devices because one from DJI is slightly more skinned and themed, while the version that Autel is running is a little bit more of that vanilla Android you would expect from a Google device. Looking under the hood here, we have a Quad HD display, 7.9 inches on the Autel smart controller, while we have a 6-inch display, or I should say a 5.5-inch display if you measure it diagonally, on the DJI smart controller, good for 1080p, and that's 400 DPI and 320 DPI. So the DJI smart controller is slightly a little bit more sharper. However, it does sacrifice some of the brightness because we only get 1,000 nits of sustained brightness on the smart controller versus the 2,000 nits of brightness on the Autel smart controller. So it's sort of a trade-off in that aspect. I do feel like this screen is really, really visible during the daytime. I also feel like the color accuracy of the Autel smart controller is a little bit more color accurate in the warmth and the depiction of the white balance versus the DJI smart controller. I always felt like the smart controller screen was a little bit too cool for my taste. And that's definitely not the case with the Autel smart controller. So that's something to keep in mind. There is also 4 gigs of RAM on both of these. If you were hoping for more like 6 or 8 gigs of RAM, you're not going to find it. We still just have 4 gigs of RAM on each of these. Now, when we talk about storage capability, 128 gigs of storage, 16 gigs of storage, non-expandable storage to an extent, and then we do have expandable storage in lieu of a SD card that you can slip in. I think I have to give the nod to the Autel smart controller in this regard because I rather have more and faster internal storage and the capability of plugging in an SSD or a USB thumb drive to this to handle file transfers versus 16 gigs, which is really super limited. And I think that when we see some of the slowdowns and the sort of the bogging down of this over time, it's because it just doesn't have enough of hard drive space to sort of read and write the system over time. And then it requires you to factory reset it. And that's just a pain in the ass because then you got to rebind and do all that over. So I am going to give the nod in the direction of the Autel smart controller in regards to that. Let's go ahead and talk about battery life for both of these. Now, battery life is sort of something interesting because we have a really, really large device, and I would expect that because this is such a large device, that it would take a long time to charge. I said that really weird, a long time to charge. This takes about an hour and a half to charge the Autel smart controller, thanks in part to its 65-watt wall charger, as to where DJI included a measly 15-watt wall charger on the DJI smart controller, which takes a really long time to charge. I mean, I've seen this thing take about 6 hours to charge, which is crazy when you think about it, especially somebody who flies pretty regularly. To try to keep this thing charged and ready to go at a moment's notice is a little bit more imperative. You have to really be more methodical with your charging, as to where the Autel smart controller, you just plug it into its 65-watt wall charger, and in an hour and 20 minutes or so, you're back up to a sustainable level of battery, which I think is great. We have a 5,000 milliamp hour battery in the DJI smart controller, where we have a 6,500 milliamp hour battery in the Autel smart controller. So it's about 1,500 more on the Autel smart controller. We're getting about 3.5 hours worth of continuous use out of this device versus I get about 2.5 to 2 hours use out of the DJI smart controller. Again, it's aged a little bit, so that time frame will vary, from person to person, but about 2.5 hours of use out of this device. Now, that extra 1,500 milliamp really does go a long way, but I would have expected a little bit more out of the Autel smart controller. But due to, in fact, of how fast this thing charges, I have to give the battery life advantage once again to the Autel smart controller. All right, let's talk about overall performance of these two devices. So we already talked about the chipsets on these. And we know that this is running a Samsung processor, and we already know that this is running the MediaTek processor. In 2 years' time, the performance aspect of these two have aged quite a bit, and the performance of the smart controller from Autel is pretty much leaps and bounds better. You're going to notice things load a lot faster. You're going to notice graphically things just look smoother. And that's in part of a better GPU. That Mali GPU that's installed on this device is just so much better than what was on the DJI smart controller. And again, that's just sort of an age gap difference. But is it enough to really say, hey, I'd rather have one over the other if I chose a drone? I don't think it is. And when I ran some benchmark tests, which I'm not going to bore you with because it took a long enough time to where I actually walked away, grabbed the beer, and had to reshoot this whole freaking thing, significantly, the Autel smart controller was faster by about, I would say, 3.5 minutes. But again, we're talking about a 2-year age gap between the two. We're talking about a name processor versus a no-name processor really in the market. You know, you got to sort of pick and choose between. But performance-wise, the Autel definitely does move quite a bit faster. All right, let's move on to compatibility, because this is where I think DJI just blows the Autel away and just really runs away with the show. So currently today, if you buy this smart controller, this is the version 1 smart controller. And I say if you buy it because you have to try to find somebody who has it in stock and selling the version 1. But if you buy this today, currently it only works with the version 1 Autel Evo 2. And that's any of the version 1 Autel Evos, from the Dual to the Pro to the 8K. That's all it's going to work with. Due to the choice that they had to make to change the chipsets due to using ZTE and, you know, that blacklisted chip, they had to make the choice to go blue, and they obviously decided that they were going to make a V1 and V2. They only made 500 of these units, so we're reviewing the version 1. Now, hardware-wise, they're going to look identical, other than one's going to be an approved chip inside and one's not going to be an approved radio chip inside. So that's really going to be the variance. Supposedly, there's also an performance improvement, but just know if you buy the version 1, it's not going to be forwards compatible with anything new that Autel creates. Now, if you did watch the video that I did with Randall, he did say that if somebody was really dead set and had their heart on something newer and they bought the V1, he would make some concessions so long as he's still in charge of Autel at that time. He said to reach out to him directly. So that is sort of a nice, you know, solace thought that if you do keep this and you want to move over to the V2, that somebody hopefully will make good on that and provide you with maybe like an upgrade at an additional cost. I don't really know how that would actually work or look, but just something to consider. Now, the DJI Smart Controller works on so many more quads. It really does give you a good selection of devices to use. And more recently, we've seen DJI move to actually supporting quads that have just recently come out with this device, such as the Air 2S. So it's going to work with the Mavic 2 Pro, Mavic 2 Zoom, Mavic Air 2, Mavic Air 2S, the Mini 2, and it will work with the Phantom 4 V2, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a lot that this will actually work with. So as far as compatibility goes, DJI has really done a good job, I think, with a product that is actually 2 years old to support it with their newer versions of lines. And I think that was something that a lot of us were really concerned with. We're going to spend $700 on this device, and is it only going to work with what's out right now? I think that's a big fear that everybody has when you buy something that's so proprietary. And I'm really happy to see that they are supporting it. And that would be one of the reasons why I did select this, even in 2021, over something like this and the Autel ecosystem. All right, I want to talk about my first impression experiences with both of these devices when I first got them, because I think that's also important to understand some of the issues that I had with each of these devices with the screen. So when I first got the DJI Smart Controller, the very first issue I had was a pop-in sensation in the screen. It was like the LCD wasn't quite laminated to the glass properly. In lieu, I basically spent about 6 months with a pop-in screen just because I couldn't turn this device in because they weren't in stock. And I relied on this so heavily. So I got another one, and the same thing was wrong with the second one I got. So this is number 3, and number 3 has done the trick. This screen is absolutely perfect. It's laminated correctly. And I think after they flushed out a lot of those issues, it was perfectly fine. Now this device, I did have some app crashing issues. Now some of that could have been in part to some beta apps, and it looks like Autel is pushing out quite a bit of firmware. If I actually open up the Autel Robotics app, before, when it was in here, it was actually prompting me for new firmware. I'm sure it'll do it again as I sit here and go through it, but it was prompting me for new firmware. So I think they're still making improvements on this to actually improve the overall quality and user experience, but it was quite buggy when I first got it in my hands. And again, that could have just been, something to do with the app, but they did go ahead and fix it. It's no longer crashing with the latest firmware, and I just saw that there is another firmware update available. Other than that, I really didn't have any problems yet. It's still too new. I'm trying to use it every day to see if anything else happens. I do notice the boot times on this are a little bit slower sometimes, and if it sits for a longer period of time, it takes longer to boot up. I'm not really sure what's up with that, but hopefully that's something Autel can address with future firmware updates. But there you go. Ultimately, it's going to be up to you as what you would choose for which drone you need or which drone ecosystem you like. I know if it was my choice right now today in 2021, I probably would still choose the smart controller if I was buying a drone based on a smart controller, just because this gives me the most amount of options to choose when it comes to deciding what quad I want. There's a lot of quads, and DJI does support things for a long period of time, so that is nice to see and know that this is almost 3 years old and they've supported it this long with enhancements and newer drones. I'm not sure how much longer they'll continue to do that or if there will be a newer version, but I think the compatibility sort of outweighs any of the performance and newness of the Autel Smart Controller. All right, that's going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed, be sure to drop a like, comment what you think of each of these smart controllers and which one you prefer. You already know my thoughts on this, but I will see you in the next video. Stay original.